4 people have been killed during protest action in Tembisa. Residents took to the streets just yesterday, citing high municipal rates as their major concern, but they were also protesting around a whole range of other issues, electricity cuts, a lack of service delivery, and a high cost of living. So this morning we're asking, what is the legal framework in which protests can be sanctioned under, and who should be held accountable for their deaths? Amnesty International's Shenilla Mohamed is on the line for us. We're also joined by protest legal expert Stanley Malemetja. To both of our guests, thanks very much indeed. Shenilla, as Amnesty International's SA Executive Director, your organization has already weighed in, saying that there must be thorough investigations into the deaths of these 4 people. It's a two-edged sword that you talked about in your tweet, the right to protest peacefully, but also how police and authorities conduct themselves during these protests.
Absolutely, Michelle. I mean, I think that, what happened yesterday is something that we see continuously. It's like a cycle, that whenever there is protest action, people are hurt, people die. And, yesterday 4 people lost their lives. And, the right to protest, peaceful protest is enshrined in the Constitution. But we think that, the challenge that we're facing is that the police and the way in which they handle public order policing is not up to the standard that it should be. And so therefore we see the indiscriminate use of these non-lethal weapons like rubber bullets. But yesterday IPID also confirmed that they were investigating the possibility of live ammunition. So, I mean, all of this is really unacceptable.
Let's bring you into the discussion, Stanley. What are we looking out for as we unpack what unfolded in Tembisa yesterday and the deaths of those 4 protesters?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think I have to agree with my colleague here that, when it comes to the constitutional right to protest, it's a double-edged sword. We would recall that according to Section 17 of the Constitution, we have 2 internal qualifiers, meaning that when a person participates in an assembly, a protest, or a demonstration, they need to do so peacefully and unarmed. Mm-hmm. So how do we say when is someone, non-peaceful? It's when the protest, degenerates to violence. And there we know that the Constitution does not offer any protection to a protest that is rather turned out violent. We also have the provisions of Section 8 of the Regulations of the Gatherings Act, which is the domestic primary legislation that governs or regulates Section 17 of the Constitution. And there it tells us about 2 important legislations as well, the Firearms Control Act and also the Dangerous Weapons Act. So it stipulates properly there that when a person participates in a protest, they are not supposed to be armed, meaning that they are not supposed to be carrying any gun or any weapon that can be dangerous if used inappropriately. But also, on the other hand, we know that the Regulations of Gatherings Act also provides for the powers of the police. And none of those powers talk about killing protesters. We know that when there's a protest, police must use force in such a way that it is only aimed at dispersing the crowd, not causing injury or not causing death. But as my fellow speaker has stated here, that in protests in South Africa, we see this theme of police brutality being, it's a cycle. And that cycle, just to be frank with it, it can also be blamed on the manner in which the IPID handles cases of police brutality and the premature closing of these cases, because when the police know that they are not going to be held accountable, this is why they can just continue with such conduct. So we do know that in South Africa, indeed, protests end up in the death or in the serious injury of those participating in protest, and in most cases, the police are not held accountable. I'll give a typical example of the Ndumba case. A bystander was just shot and nobody's held accountable, and the NPA decided to drop charges. So it's really appalling what we see in South Africa when people exercise their constitutional right to protest.
Yeah. So Shenilla, how do we understand this story? Because what Stanley is talking about is the responsibility of police insofar as protests are concerned, right? How do we balance that against the very nature of protest action when it comes to service delivery in our country? And the nature of that is violence. It's the destruction of property. How are police meant to engage with protesters in a context like that?
Well, I think, Michelle, as Stanley says, that, the law does not provide for protection for people who protest in a violent manner or carry arms or weapons. And I think that, I think South Africans have to start to think about different ways of holding their states to account. And, violent protest action actually opens the doors for the police to make excuses for why they had to do what they did. Often you will hear the police minister saying that, it escalated into violence. The police officers had to do what they did. But as Stanley rightly says, the use of force has got to be proportionate and has got to make sense to the situation. And, often what we see is the police themselves start to panic. I mean, yesterday we heard that the police were overwhelmed. I mean, how are police overwhelmed in a country that has a history of protest action? Surely by now you should know what to do during a protest action. We have constantly called for the non-use of non-lethal weapons like rubber bullets. I mean, there's an assumption that these don't damage. They cause a huge amount of damage and death. So as Stanley has said, the role should be to actually disperse the crowd or to ensure that, the violence doesn't take place. But I think the other very important issue raised by Stanley is the lack of accountability. The fact that, police can go in there, use these weapons, even live ammunition to some extent, and nobody is ever held to account. So people in South Africa die with no accountability. There is no one held responsibility for the deaths of people who are out there protesting. Now, not all protesters are violent. And we saw that, during the reportage that has come through. But unfortunately, some are. And that comes at the cost of the others. So you ask me what the police should do. I mean, the police should be properly trained. The police should go in and try to disperse rather than injure and kill.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of protesters being killed by these supposed non-lethal weapons. I mean, that was the weapon that killed Mthokozisi Ntumba in those protests that happened in Braamfontein just last year. And as Stanley mentioned, the officers there were cleared of any charges, the NPA dropping the case due to a lack of evidence. Stanley, the issues that Shenilla has just brought up about the lack of training for police, that still we continue to see incidents of this nature when it comes to protest action. And of course, the most extreme example is Marikana.
No, that's very correct. There's actually also, I think, a research, I just can't recall the name of the organization that conducted the research into the use of rubber bullets during crowd management. What that research has found is that when a rubber bullet is projected from the gun, it must not, immediately when the rubber bullet leaves the barrel of the gun, it must not come into direct contact with human flesh. It is actually meant to ricochet. So it must actually hit a certain object, be it the road in most or the ground. So what it means is that the police, if properly trained, when they use rubber bullets, they must point to the ground because the aim is to disperse the crowd and not to inflict injury. And another concerning thing, you would have seen in the report following the July unrest that Gauteng only has one water cannon vehicle, and those are the types of the types of objects, yes, that can be used during crowd control. South Africa alone records over 200. It records over 2,000 protests, service delivery protests in a year. So as Shenilla has said, it is really appalling that in a country that has been deemed the protest capital or the protest nation, we still have protesters dying. Yeah. So, and also, it serves as a, it should serve as a message to the protesters, because once you engage in violence during a protest, it actually delegitimizes the reasons why you are engaging in a protest. So when people engage in a protest and it turns out violence, you are actually allowing the state to avoid accountability as to why they are unable to ensure access to basic services. And I mean, even the word itself says it's a basic service. People shouldn't be running up in the street to achieve or to have access to something so basic such as water, something so basic such as sanitation.
Various different issues colliding here. Shenilla, I want to get just a final comment from you. I mean, what Stanley has just said about the aim of police in a protest situation. It's to disperse. It's not to inflict injury. And I can tell you from being at several service delivery protests over the years that police, when they are firing rubber bullets, they do not fire to the ground, as Stanley's saying, with the aim of ricocheting. They fire towards protesters.
Absolutely. And you know what, Michelle, I mean, that is a clear indication that the police have no idea how to deal with public order policing. You know, the minister keeps on saying, well, the army is not trained in dealing with public order policing, but his men are also not trained, and women are also not trained adequately in public order policing. And I said, you know, we have reached out to them, Michelle, on a number of occasions to say, look, from around the world, we can offer training, we can, you know, try to assist in any way we can, but we're never taken up on that offer. And I'm not saying we have all the answers, but what I'm saying is the police need to first acknowledge that they do not have the right skills to deal with massive crowds. And secondly, you know, they need to tell us what they're going to do about that, because we cannot be sitting here, you know, all the time, Michelle, talking about people who have died while exercising their right to protest. But also the lack of basic essential services in this country is a huge problem. And, you know, the state needs to deal with that. People should not, as Stanley says, have to go out into the streets and die because they want water, because they want basic human rights. And I think we have a massive problem in South Africa. And unless the state deals with this adequately, it's going to get worse and worse, and we are going to see more and more people being killed while exercising their basic rights.
A whole range of issues colliding in the story unfolding in Tembisa. Let me thank both of our guests for weighing in. Shenilla Mohamed is Amnesty International's SA Executive Director, and Stanley Malemetja is a protest law attorney. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.